Hi, today we will try to make some predictions for 2025.
I believe that in the second half of 2025, the active phase of the war will end, hostilities will cease, and it, but not conclude with a victory for Vladimir Putin and his army. How exactly this will happen and when, I cannot say for certain. However, I assume that closer to the second half of the year, the Russian Federation will run out of military and financial resources. As a result, the Russian army will lose the ability to advance actively, both in terms of finances and military operations. In this war, Russia has only succeeded when it is advancing. It's like a bicycle that stays upright only when it moves forward. When the offensive stops, processes of decay and collapse begin within the Russian army and society. You might wonder why I believe Russia's resources will run out by the second half of the year. My answer is simple. The Russian Federation has already entered a period of very high inflation. During the long New Year holidays, when the country traditionally doesn't work but consumes heavily, buying gifts, drinking and attending events, prices inevitably rise and the ruble's value falls. This phenomenon repeats every January. Last December, the Central Bank of Russia injected 2.3 trillion rubles, essentially unbacked money, into the economy to cover a budget deficit. Additionally, in January, Russian defense enterprises typically receive a 30% advance for state orders for the entire year. This amounts to trillions of rubles entering the economy. Within weeks, much of this money floods into a market with limited goods and services, causing wholesale and retail prices to skyrocket, triggering inflation and devaluing the ruble. The effects are inevitable. Inflation will explode, the ruble's value will collapse and prices will rise sharply. For example, the ruble recently dropped to 113 per dollar in the free market, although the official rate hovers around 105 per dollar. Traders are stockpiling foreign currency because they anticipate a flood of rubles with limited goods and services available. My estimate is that January's real inflation will be at least 25% annually. Stopping inflation at that level is nearly impossible without drastic economic policy changes, such as replacing the government or central bank leadership or discovering new oil reserves. In Russia's case, the primary solution would be ending the war. But for Vladimir Putin, this option is off the table. Military spending will continue to weigh heavily on the budget, driving inflation further. The central bank's recent refusal to raise interest rates signals its inability to contain inflation. Consequently, inflation will remain high throughout January, February, and likely the entire year. I place significant hope on this inflation as a key factor in undermining the Russian economy. High inflation discourages investment, devalues profits, reduces living standards, and disrupts normal economic functioning. Inflation particularly impacts sectors like defense, where production cycles are long and prices are fixed. Moreover, inflation erodes the value of recruitment payments for the military. Currently, new recruits are offered 2 million rubles to join, but inflation rapidly devalues these payments, reducing their purchasing power. By February or even end of January, the government may need to increase recruitment payments to maintain army numbers, further inflating the budget and exacerbating inflation. This cycle will continue until the war ends, as it is the main burden on Russia's fragile economy. In 2022, the Russian economy had reserves to absorb the war's costs. By 2024, those reserves were nearly exhausted, and inflation added weight month by month. In 2025, inflation will grow even faster, increasing monthly by 3 to 4%, leading to an inevitable economic downturn. Russia's hopes for external support, such as from China, remain unfulfilled. China, facing its own economic challenges, is reluctant to provide more than moral support. Other BRICS countries have also distanced themselves, understanding the risks of associating with Putin. The only real way to salvage the Russian economy would be lifting Western sanctions, but this would require concessions, such as accepting Donald Trump's proposed peace plan for Ukraine, something Putin and his government have categorically rejected. Thus, the key indicators to watch in 2025 are inflation rates, the ruble's exchange rate, and the state of the economy. I expect these indicators to hit critical levels by spring or summer, forcing Putin to seek a truce. Additionally, there are military factors that could push Russia toward a truce. The Russian army is weakening, with a declining number of recruits despite high payments. This is due to demographic realities and the shrinking pool of eligible individuals willing to die for Putin. The strikes on Russian arsenals and oil bases have caused significant disruptions in the logistics of supplying Russian troops with ammunition and fuel. While the quantity of fuel and shells has not drastically decreased, the lack of reliable storage and distribution facilities for oil products and ammunition has made it increasingly difficult to deliver these supplies to the front lines at the right time and in sufficient quantities. Continued long-range strikes will further complicate the Russian offensive. For any offensive to succeed, tanks, howitzers, infantry, ammunition, shells, and fuel must be coordinated and delivered to the same place at the same time under unified command. The destruction of storage facilities, headquarters, and other infrastructure has prevented the Russians from assembling a decisive force capable of breaking through Ukrainian defenses and advancing significantly, such as reaching the Dnieper River. Instead, their progress has been limited to small, incremental gains with no major breakthroughs due to logistical failures. The reduced use of CAB and FAB bombs has also decreased Ukrainian casualties at the front, as these weapons were previously a primary means for Russia to breach Ukrainian defenses. Over time, the trend has shifted in Ukraine's favor. Russian offensives are slowing, becoming harder to execute, and resulting in greater losses. The Russian military is increasingly reliant on manpower rather than equipment and long-range strikes to achieve the same results as earlier in the conflict. Russian military logistics heavily depend on railroads, and as the front line has moved away from the railroad-dense areas of Donbass, supplying troops on the front line has become much harder. This reliance on rail infrastructure continues to hinder Russia's ability to advance effectively where railroads are scarce. A critical aspect of Ukraine's recent successes has been the frequent targeting of Russian headquarters with precision missile strikes, which occur almost weekly. For instance, the destruction of a Russian headquarters in the Kursk region on December 30 severely impacted their operations. Without functioning headquarters, Russian forces struggled to advance or even defend effectively. Despite plans to push Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk region by the new year, or by January 20th, coinciding with the inauguration of Donald Trump, the Russian army has not achieved these goals. Ukrainian forces describe the situation as difficult but manageable, with no collapse of the front or significant retreats. The defense remains strong due to the continued destruction of Russian logistics and command structures. Another emerging trend is the technological advancements of Ukrainian unmanned sea drones. These drones are now equipped with weapons capable of targeting Russian helicopters, which had previously patrolled the coastline and engaged sea drones with minimal risk. Recently, Ukrainian drones successfully shot down 2 Russian helicopters, causing severe losses to experienced crews and creating a strategic problem for the Russian military. Helicopters were the primary means of combating Ukrainian sea drones, and their reduced effectiveness gives Ukraine's naval drones greater freedom of action. This newfound freedom could allow Ukraine to impose a blockade around key Russian ports like Novorossiysk and Tuapse, striking tankers of the Russian shadow fleet involved in oil exports. Such actions would deal a devastating blow to the Russian economy, as about a third of all Russian oil exports pass through these ports. By declaring these areas as conflict zones and warning civilian ships to stay away, Ukraine will enforce a maritime blockade, further crippling Russia's ability to sustain its war efforts. Of course, Russia, being a law-abiding country in its own peculiar way, is unlikely to heed these warnings. The tankers of its shadow fleet will continue their routes undeterred. There is little reason to feel sympathy for them, as Russia has repeatedly targeted Ukrainian vessels and ships entering Ukrainian ports. It's only fair to respond in kind. There's an understandable concern about the risk of oil spills. Some might argue against attacking tankers because of the potential environmental damage when oil tankers sink. We've all seen the devastating consequences of such incidents. However, a smarter approach would be to target tankers while they are still empty, docked in ports like Novorossiysk and Tuapse. Empty tankers pose little risk of catastrophic oil spills, even if they are sunk. It likely wouldn't take the sinking of many such ships to make a significant impact. A couple of incidents would be enough to deter others from continuing operations in these ports. The risks, rising insurance costs, and general impracticality would likely force shipping companies to reconsider their routes. This, in turn, could deliver a severe blow to the Russian economy. Ukraine, or perhaps its allies, might already have experience in conducting such operations. For instance, there was a recent case of the Russian gas carrier Ursa Major, which mysteriously sank in the Mediterranean. This vessel transported strategic and military cargo for Russia. The exact cause of the explosions that sank it remains unclear, whether they were due to unmanned vessels, onboard explosives, or other factors. Regardless, this incident is significantly underestimated in its implications. The Ursa Major was transporting port cranes intended to increase the capacity of Vladivostok's port in Russia's Far East, a critical hub for Russian imports, particularly from China. These high-tech cranes, custom-made in Spain, represented an essential upgrade for Russia's strained logistical infrastructure. Their loss means a continued bottleneck in the transportation of goods from the Far East to central Russia, severely limiting port capacity. Moreover, the Ursa Major was also carrying key components for the reactors of Russia's lighter icebreakers, which were intended to enhance the Northern Sea route, a strategic alternative for transporting goods. With the reactor components now lying at the bottom of the Mediterranean, these icebreakers cannot be completed anytime soon, stalling Russia's plans to expand its Arctic shipping capabilities. This event is comparable to the destruction of a newly constructed railway bridge on the Trans-Siberian Railway. While Russia's existing capacities remain unchanged, the planned expansions, crucial to improving its economic and logistical network, are now unattainable. The sinking of the Ursa Major was a significant victory for whoever orchestrated it. While there is no definitive proof that Ukrainian or Allied drones were responsible, it sets a precedent for targeting Russian vessels globally. By initiating war against Ukraine, Russia effectively opened itself to attacks on its warships and trading vessels, giving Ukraine the moral and strategic right to retaliate in kind. If similar actions were to expand, targeting Russian oil shipments through the Black Sea alone could cripple the Russian economy. A collapse of the economy will likely force Vladimir Putin to consider a truce or a cessation of hostilities. This brings us to another crucial development, the impending inauguration of Donald Trump as the next president and his proposed peace initiative. Trump has reportedly communicated terms for a ceasefire to Russia's leadership. However, Putin and his officials have categorically rejected these proposals, demanding concessions far beyond what Trump is willing to offer. Trump, known for his uncompromising style, may find Putin's rejection a personal insult. This situation leaves Trump with three options: concede to Putin's demands, abandon the peace process altogether, or pressure Putin by bolstering Ukraine's defenses. The first option seems improbable, given Trump's perception of Putin as weakened by the ongoing war and economic hardships. The second option, Trump losing interest and withdrawing from the situation, aligns with his past behavior when quick successes eluded him. However, abandoning Ukraine entirely would be inconsistent with Trump's repeated promises to secure peace in Europe. Despite his unpredictability, Trump has invested heavily in this pledge and may seek to fulfill it by pressuring Putin into a compromise. The world watches as this complex situation unfolds, with implications for Ukraine, Russia, and global stability. As mentioned earlier, long-range strikes on Russian targets have already caused significant issues for the Russian army. If there is an increase in such strikes, particularly on Russian targets, it will severely undermine the military resources of the Russian Federation in the coming months, making it difficult for Russia to advance. This also applies to the enhancement of Ukrainian aviation capabilities. At the beginning of this year, new F-16 aircraft should be arriving in Ukraine, and French Mirages are being prepared. There were even discussions about Swedish Saab aircraft potentially arriving. In modern warfare, aviation plays a key role, especially when fighting under NATO standards, which Ukraine is trying to adopt. Powerful aviation, at least equal to Russia's, can significantly alter the situation on the front line. America has the ability to apply pressure on Russia, signaling that the strengthening of Ukrainian aviation will continue if Russia refuses to pursue peace. The Ukrainian Air Force is now actively using American and French high-precision missiles and air-to-ground munitions, which are similar to Russian CABs and FABs but much more accurate. These missiles fly farther and hit more precisely than their Russian counterparts, making their application highly effective. Russian channels have reported significant losses from these missiles and bombs, and the Russian army lacks effective protection against them. If Trump were to engage with Russia, he could convey to Ukraine that he is unafraid of escalation. Trump has shown in the past, such as when he authorized the killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, that he is not concerned with the consequences of such actions. While Biden was cautious about escalation, Trump will likely take a more aggressive stance if he were in office, making decisions regardless of potential complications. Additionally, Trump will severely limit Russia's ability to sell oil. He has promised to increase oil production in the US, which could offset any lost Russian oil exports due to sanctions. Ukraine will also block key roads such as Novorossiysk and Tuapse, cutting off Russia's ability to export about a third of its oil via the Black Sea. However, there are also northern routes through the Baltic Sea, where Finland recently halted a Russian shadow tanker suspected of espionage. Russia, in response to such actions, will attempt to pressure countries like Denmark and Estonia by threatening military retaliation. But these countries have the option to refuse access to their territorial waters for Russian ships, in line with international maritime law. Trump's support will make Denmark and other Baltic nations more confident in standing against Russian threats. The West has many ways to challenge Putin and his military economy. While Biden has been reluctant to take strong actions, Trump will likely be less hesitant to do so, although it remains uncertain whether he will follow through. Putin, for his part, is confident that he can force the West to accept his terms for a truce. However, Ukrainian drone strikes and other actions in the Black Sea will show that Ukraine can take steps to stop Russian oil exports, particularly from Novorossiysk. Combining military pressure with economic measures like an oil blockade will force Putin to accept a truce, potentially leading to the end of hostilities in Ukraine in the second half of 2025. If the West applies minimal political will, a resolution could be reached, possibly by September. However, if Europe and the US remain hesitant, we may have to wait until Russia's inflation leads to economic collapse. Likely by the end of 2025, the precarious position of Russia's military presence in Syria has been under increasing scrutiny due to shifting geopolitical dynamics. The potential loss of Russia's military bases in Syria will serve as a devastating blow to President Vladimir Putin's strategic ambitions and will ignite significant political fallout domestically. Russia's bases in Tartus and Khmeimim represent critical outposts for projecting power in the Middle East. However, with growing international isolation, intensified economic pressures from sanctions, and reduced logistical capabilities due to the war in Ukraine, Moscow's ability to sustain its foothold in Syria is increasingly tenuous. A loss of these bases will signify a retreat from one of Putin's key geopolitical achievements, unraveling his narrative of Russia's resurgence as a global superpower. Domestically, Putin's image as a decisive and powerful leader relies heavily on projecting strength abroad. The loss of Syria's military bases will expose vulnerabilities in Russia's foreign policy and military strategy. This failure will undermine public confidence in his leadership, particularly among nationalist factions and the military elite, who view Syria as a critical symbol of Russian influence. Without its bases, Russia will lose a vital operational hub in the Mediterranean, reducing its capacity to influence the Middle East. This shift will embolden adversaries like the United States and Turkey to assert greater control in Syria, further eroding Moscow's strategic positioning in the region. The combination of military failures in Ukraine, economic turmoil, and the loss of strategic assets in Syria will exacerbate tensions within the Kremlin. Dissatisfaction among the elite and military leaders will culminate in a power struggle, increasing the likelihood of a coup. The narrative of Putin's invincibility will crumble, creating an opportunity for rival factions to challenge his authority. The Kremlin's power dynamics have always been precarious, with Putin maintaining control through a careful balance of elite interests. A high-profile failure like losing Syria's bases will tip this balance. The erosion of trust in his leadership will embolden discontented figures within the military, security services, or oligarchic circles to orchestrate a coup, potentially marking the end of Putin's regime. In summary, that's what will happen in 2025. Donald Trump's presidency will bring a more aggressive US stance, potentially pressuring Putin with increased military aid to Ukraine and energy market disruptions. Increased military and economic measures from Ukraine and its allies, including targeting Russian oil exports and enhancing Ukrainian aviation with advanced NATO standard equipment, will amplify pressure on Russia. High inflation, devaluation of the ruble, and continued war expenditures are predicted to cripple Russia's economy. Inflation rates are expected to reach critical levels by spring or summer, forcing the Kremlin into peace negotiations. Continued strikes on Russian logistics hubs, headquarters, and infrastructure will weaken the Russian army's operational capabilities, exacerbating its reliance on manpower and limiting offensive success. Ukraine's growing capability to target Russian naval and oil infrastructure could result in a de facto blockade, severely impacting Russia's economy and war effort. The introduction of F-16 seconds, Mirages and precision munitions will give Ukraine a strategic edge, making Russian advances increasingly difficult. The war in Ukraine is expected to transition into a truce by the second half of 2025, driven by the exhaustion of Russia's financial and military resources. The combined economic, military and geopolitical pressures suggest that 2025 will be a pivotal year, with the war likely ending not through decisive victory, but through the collapse of Russia's capacity to sustain it. As the war in Ukraine continues, the devastation extends far beyond the battlefield. Landmines and unexploded ordnance are turning towns, fields and roads into deadly traps, leaving communities unable to rebuild or even return home safely. At International Action Alliance Ltd., a not-for-profit organization I founded earlier this year, we're committed to changing this. Our demining and contamination assessment project aims to clear these hidden dangers, restore safety, and help Ukraine recover from the scars of war. Your support can make a tangible difference. By contributing to our demining efforts, you'll help provide the tools, training, and expertise needed to clear landmines effectively and assess exposure to the present contaminants in war-affected regions. This isn't just about saving lives, it's about giving families the chance to reclaim their homes and farmers the opportunity to cultivate their land again. Together, we can ensure that Ukraine's future isn't overshadowed by the remnants of war. Let's stand with Ukraine. Please consider donating to our demining project and being part of the solution. Every contribution brings us closer to a safer, brighter future for Ukraine.